Last week I shared some basic thoughts on the mark of the beast and why I think it's likely a spiritual mark rather than something physical. And I'm sure that some of you thought, but that's not what my Left Behind books told me. And you'd be right. But that's because I don't read Revelation as if it's giving me a detailed account of the end times. You see, the assumptions that we hold when we read or listen to something have a huge impact on what we get out of it. And this is nowhere more true than when it comes to Revelation, since this is such a complex, highly symbolic book. If I assume that Revelation is foretelling the years leading up to Jesus' return, those last 10 years or whatever, then that's what I'll see. Likewise, if I assume that Revelation is a map of Christian history, then that's what I'll see. Whatever assumptions we bring to this book will inevitably shape how we perceive its message. This is one of the reasons there are so many different views of Revelation. Everyone has a different idea of what it is. So is Revelation a locked box? Is there any way to get at what the true message was and is? Do we simply pick the view that makes us feel the best? Is there anything we can do to make sense of this book? I believe there is. As I've studied and read Revelation over the past several years, I've come across several assumptions that the text itself seems to imply. You see, I think that the Revelation actually informs us what we should assume about it. Although there are a number of different assumptions that we should make and we could make, I want to highlight three today. The first one is that Revelation is a book of symbols. There are a handful of books like Revelation in the Bible. There are some similar passages that are in Daniel and in Zechariah and even the Gospels. But if we look outside of the Bible, we quickly realize that Revelation isn't nearly as unique as we might first think. Revelation is a piece of what's called apocalyptic literature. So, what is apocalyptic literature? Well, in Marvin Pate's book, Interpreting Revelation and Other Apocalyptic Literature, he describes it as being a uniquely Jewish kind of writing that was birthed out of Old Testament prophets like Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. It generally involves graphic depictions of the supernatural, things like angels, demons, giant beasts, etc. And it was almost always written during times of national trauma or tragedy, things like the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And if you start to read some of this apocalyptic literature that was written around the turn of the millennium, things like the Book of Enoch or the War Scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls, then you'll quickly realize that apocalyptic literature makes ample use of symbolism. Think of Daniel's description of the world kingdoms in Daniel 2 and 7. John didn't intend us to take 100-pound hail, horse-sized locusts, or 7-headed dragons literally. How do I know? Well, for one thing, that's just not how apocalyptic literature works. But for another thing, John's angelic guide usually tells him what many of the symbols are symbols of. For example, in the first chapter, John is told by Jesus that the 7 lampstands which surround him are, quote, the 7 churches. Likewise, he writes there at the end that the dragon is the serpent of old who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. This book is filled with these kinds of asides where John points behind the image to a deeper reality. We should be careful, though, that we don't turn Revelation into an allegory where everything and every description of everything has a symbolic or spiritual meaning. Many of the symbols in Revelation are broad. For example, hail, fire, locust, blood are all symbolic of God's judgment. I believe many interpreters have gone off the rails by looking for deeper meanings than what's really there. And as we'll see in our next point, we shouldn't read the symbols in Revelation too closely. However, if we forget that Revelation is a book of symbols, we'll inevitably turn it into a horror story rather than the glorious gospel message that it is. So why does this matter? Well, if Revelation is a symbolic book, then we need to be careful about what we take literally. We should look for symbols that carry over from the Old Testament. I would especially note the parallels between Genesis and Exodus and the book of Revelation. For example, John tore many of the plagues in Revelation right out of the pages of Exodus and Israel's escape from Egypt. That is not a coincidence. These are the kinds of symbolic connections and references that are important to note as we read Revelation. All right, so point number 2. Revelation was meant to be heard. In Revelation 1:3, John pronounces a blessing on, quote, "he who reads and those who hear the words of the prophecy." Now, though it may not seem like it, this is a significant point. Why? Well, we ought to note that the verb for to read here is especially used of public reading in the congregation. In fact, some translations even use the phrase read aloud here. And that's not all. John's blessing also extends to whom? Those who hear the words of the prophecy. In other words, Revelation was meant to be read or performed for a congregational audience. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, well, so what? I mean, it's well known that many people couldn't read in the first century. Books weren't exactly cheap. They had to have somebody read it to them. Why is this fact important for the way we understand Revelation? Well, just listen to how one scholar, R. Paul Stevens, describes it. Revelation was intended to be read aloud and inwardly digested through listening with the heart, not to be studied and analyzed. It has what Sweet calls an auditory logic through which John invites his reader-hearers to share his contemplation through their own heart responsiveness. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Paul Barnett shows that, along with many other New Testament books, Revelation was written to be read aloud. It is fundamentally oral and dramatic in character. Speaking to this, one scholar observed that a written text was essentially a transcription which, like modern musical notation, became an intelligible message only when it was performed orally to others or to oneself. When read aloud, Revelation would have the effect of a symphony performed, which is real when heard rather than seen. Think for a moment about the way many people have interpreted Revelation. One approach is to treat it as if each word has special significance. Some even act as if it's an encoded book that we have to translate. So they see the word fire or hail in the Revelation, then they go searching for the right translation of that word. Well, what does that really mean? But this is a recipe for disaster and confusion. It opens the door to reading Revelation any way we want, so long as we can make some connection from here to there, no matter how tenuous or brittle. Some go a step further by building up convoluted explanations for why certain ideas in Revelation really mean this or that. For example, I mentioned last week Uriah Smith, the Seventh-day Adventist interpreter of Revelation. He went to great lengths to prove that the mark of the beast was worshiping on Sunday. And his explanation, it was logical, but it's also so complex there is no way anyone hearing Revelation read would have come to his conclusions. And that's why it's important to constantly remember that John wrote Revelation as an audiobook. Think of it in terms of art. Many people treat this book, Revelation, as if it's a realistic landscape, like this one, for example. Notice how examining the painting up close doesn't really confuse us, since the artist used such a fine brush. We can see the individual stalks of grain, the little white flowers. There's even this dead bird lying in the road. And if we look up toward the horizon, there are birds just barely visible. If we had the actual painting instead of a photograph, examining it up close might reveal even more details. Now, this doesn't mean that we wouldn't at times need to back up and look at the whole thing in order to truly grasp its overall beauty, but it would mean that we could understand it regardless of whether we examined it up close or far away. Compare this to an impressionistic painting. It is much harder to appreciate the beauty of impressionistic artwork when we examine it up close. From far away we can make sense of it all, but when we zoom up too close we can't make heads or tails of it. If I were just to show you the zoomed up sections of this painting, would you be able to identify it? It may be the ocean, or the sky, maybe a shirt or a hat, or any number of other blue things. There's simply no way to tell until we back up, because impressionistic artwork can only be understood from a distance. And if we try to zoom up too closely, well, we'll miss the forest for the trees, or to keep the painting metaphor, we'll miss the painting for its strokes. So, why all this talk about painting? If I take seriously the fact that John wrote Revelation to be read and heard, then I need to also take seriously the possibility that Revelation is a work of art done in an impressionistic style rather than a realistic one. Hearing this book read aloud would not give you the time to construct convoluted arguments linking the mark of the beast with Sunday worship or any other thing. Instead, it would paint a more general picture of taking on qualities and characteristics of the beast. Recently, I've been thinking about Revelation more and more as a sort of first century movie. There are various scenes and the action moves quickly from here to there. You might not hear every word of dialogue or notice every little Easter egg, but at the end you know the basic plot. And on repeat viewings, you notice even more. The second, third, and fourth viewings reveal a kind of depth, that isn't obvious at first. And I think Revelation works the same way. So why does this matter? Well, if John wrote Revelation to be heard rather than read silently, then we should treat it like an impressionistic painting. We should look for broad strokes and themes and symbols and words and images. Likewise, we should take it in passages rather than verses or even individual words, and we should beware of overly complicated interpretations. You can listen to an audio version of Revelation in less than an hour and a half. Why don't you try listening to a chapter or two this week? Don't focus on all the details, get caught up in all the minutia. Just look for the big picture. Let it be a sort of first century movie in your mind. Let it affect your gut rather than just your head. Finally, point 3. Revelation was meant to be understood immediately. From early in the book, an angel guides John through the vision, interpreting certain symbols, pointing things out along the way. Before the angel departs, he shares one final command. John writes, "And he said to me, 'Do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near.'" Now, this by itself might not mean much. After all, there's a lot of talk about Jesus' second coming being near in the New Testament. He still hasn't come, so that doesn't necessarily imply anything by itself. However, we ought to note that the command John records here is very similar to one that Daniel receives at the end of his prophecy, with one slight difference. At the end of Daniel's prophecy, the angel who delivers his vision tells him, "But as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase." 5 verses later, he repeats himself. "Go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end time." Daniel wrote a sealed book. No one could understand it until a later time. But the angel called Revelation an unsealed book because the time is near. There is nothing in the book of Revelation that implies time must pass before it becomes clear. This sets it apart from Daniel. Revelation was understandable. This is made even more evident by several statements in Revelation which imply that its original hearers could have understood certain things within it. For example, like I said last week, when John writes about the beast and his famous number 666, he says, "Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast." John doesn't say, "Let him who has understanding way off in the future as knowledge increases." He writes as if his original audience could have understood what he was talking about. And in fact, I believe any first century hearer would have rightly assumed that he could calculate the number. In other words, it's only natural to think that this would have made sense right away. Now, there is no reason to assume that time needed to pass for Revelation to be understood. And there's every reason, including the command in Revelation 22:10, to assume that John wrote Revelation as an intelligible book in his own day. In addition to this, Revelation includes many allusions to John's first century culture. Chapters 2 and 3 are explicitly about congregations that existed in John's day. All of this simply reinforces the idea that Revelation was a book that had immediate meaning. So why does this matter? Well, if John wrote Revelation to be immediately understood, then we should treat it more like we treat the rest of Scripture. We should seek to understand the original context as best we can. We should try to understand what it meant to them before we look for a modern day or even future meaning. And we should be wary of any interpretation that makes the book meaningless until a date in the future, or even a date after the 1st or 2nd century. Honestly, I could go on and on about these 3 assumptions as well as a number of others that have been kind of rolling around in my head as I've studied Revelation. I believe it's vitally important that we approach this book from the right angle. If we ask Revelation the wrong questions, we will get the wrong answers. So the next time you pick up your Bible and flip open to Revelation, keep these 3 things in mind. This is an apocalyptic book filled with lots of symbols. This is a book that was meant to be heard or even performed rather than quietly or silently read. This is a book that could have been understood by its original readers. By keeping these 3 things in mind, you'll be less likely, much less likely, to butcher the way you understand it. And you'll be more likely to get close to its intended meaning. And this intended meaning is where you'll find what God is saying through this powerful, if at times confusing book. So, I hope these thoughts were helpful. I'd love to hear the assumptions you bring to the text of Revelation. So leave a comment and let me know. And if you got something out of this week's video, click the subscribe button. That way you won't miss any of our weekly videos released on Fridays.